I have always wondered what a fighter like Gilbert Burns trains in between fights. When you've been practicing jiu-jitsu as long as he has, it becomes tough to find opponents that continue to push your skills. So I decided to ask him. To paraphrase his answer, Gilbert essentially described to me a triangular concept. Gilbert is always thinking of three things: striking, submitting, advancing position. That last one is a little broad, but essentially if the game plan is to strike with an opponent, advancing means getting back up. However, if the game plan is to grapple with the opponent, advancing becomes inherently linked to his other two triangular points. If the game plan is for Gilbert to try and TKO his opponent on the ground, advancing then refers to getting to his favored striking positions. If the game plan is to try and submit his opponent, then advancing refers to getting to his favorite submission positions while using traps to set up the finish. Thinking back on this conversation, another fighter sprang to mind who demonstrates a very similar approach to MMA grappling as Gilbert does. I want to highlight a particular sequence in Casey's first fight to start off. After landing back and forth damage with Shauna on the feet, Casey is able to successfully ground Shauna by means of a power double against the fence. Shauna tries to pull away from Casey to create space for a get-up, while Casey sets up a body lock to control Shauna. Shauna reads this and initiates a scramble by rolling through her left shoulder, which gets Casey off balance. Casey immediately fights to grab a single leg and powers forward. The key here was that Casey made a minor positional mistake that Dobson punished with the rolling scramble. Once at disadvantage, Casey immediately fights her way back to her feet. At the start of the second round, we see a very similar situation play out again. Casey downs Dobson with a body lock, to which Dobson rolls, and Casey stifles the scramble, ending up retaining her back control. But Laura Procopio's fight with Casey offers the best example. Casey attempts a knee that Laura catches and chains into a takedown. Casey immediately fights her way into a Kimura trap/sweep setup, which threatens the submission as well as the positional advances of Gilbert's triangle. Casey gets her foot in position and begins leveraging Procopio to advance the sweep attempt. Laura defends it and enters Casey's guard. Casey doesn't let a moment pass and immediately begins fighting Procopio for attempting a gogoplata and tossing some elbows down with it for good measure. To top it off, Casey kicks her off from bottom. This is essentially the ideal version of what Gilbert was describing in his triangle: activity, aggression, and striking violence, goal-oriented and motivated by a game plan. But it is against Antonina Shevchenko that a hole begins to emerge with Casey. Antonina fights much like her younger sister and former flyweight champion Valentina. Both are counter-oriented strikers that prefer to go second on opponents' entries. This is exactly the type of fighter Casey needs to face in order to develop her striking. Casey's striking offense has to this point been mainly linear strikes like jabs and straights, paired with high kicks and relatively consistent patterns of attack. Antonina was never really able to get a rhythm against Casey's offense, mainly I believe due to the open stance alignment. Casey is fighting out of orthodox with her left hand leading, whereas Antonina is fighting out of southpaw with her right hand leading. The quintessential description of this battle is one of footwork. Casey, favoring linear strikes, wants to constantly battle for outside leverage, meaning that her lead foot is outside of her opponent's lead foot. The idea being that the outside foot has the greatest leverage on linear strikes, like the most common strike from this alignment and setup, the rear hand straight. As Antonina favors counters, she needs to make a choice. Does she want to counter with the aforementioned linear strikes by battling for outside leverage while at the disadvantage of being on the back foot to set up the counter, or does she choose to lean into a hook as her counter by allowing Casey the outside leverage and attempting to time Casey's open jaw on the straight right with a lead hook counter? Antonina chooses the former and consistently loses the footwork battle to Casey. Casey wears her down before TKOing her to make it 3 straight victories to begin her career. After finishing Antonina, Casey faces off against Roxanne Modafferi. This just so happened to be Roxanne's retirement fight, and you couldn't have written a better storyline.
I'm here with Roxanne Modafferi. Roxy, it has been one hell of a journey.
On the other side,
big fight coming up here against a legend of MMA on a pay-per-view card. Does this one feel like the biggest fight of your career for sure? Is it difficult at all to have to play that spoiler role?
I don't care. It doesn't change anything for me. You know, my career goes on the same. This is just another step in my journey, and what she does is on her. So I'm taking it nothing different than the rest of my fights. I respect everything that she's done for female mixed martial arts for sure. She was fighting before any of us were underground, so that's awesome and good for her. But no, this is my time. I'm the new era, and I'm going to show that on Saturday night. I think that people are forgetting, like, she's lost 3 fights in a row, she's on her way out. And
it felt like I was about to watch a car accident. The fight starts out roughly how one would expect, as Casey refuses to shake Roxanne's hand to open the hostilities. Roxanne shakes off the lack of opening sportsmanship and immediately puts a pace on Casey that no fighter has prior. Seeing Modafferi essentially reverse Casey's usual pressure binary and come out with her own pressure was a surprise. Roxanne doesn't pack the same thump as Casey, but she makes up for it in volume. After enough punches had snuck through Casey's guard, her nose began to bleed, and she ends the round with a clearly defined black left eye. The second round progresses much the same, before Casey begins Spartan roaring at Roxanne going into the corners.
Talking about the crowd's up. Look at it.
The third round continues with the two fighters landing shot after shot on each other, going to set a record for most strikes landed in a 3-round women's flyweight fight. This fight was pretty clearly a 29-28 victory for Casey, yet somehow the judges were split.
Robert Alexander scores it. 29-28, Modafferi.
The boos began raining down immediately. For the first time in a while, a fighter had intentionally drawn heat as a heel. It's one thing for Aljamain to get booed because an audience considered a fight boring. It's another for a fan to actively want to see you lose because of things you did and said leading up to this fight. Then this happened. Casey was next scheduled to face Jessica Ai in what ended up being her last fight with the promotion, giving Casey the chance to knock off 2 retiring pioneers. Unfortunately, in the training leading up to the fight, Casey tore her ACL and had to pull out. After a little over 6-month layoff for surgery and rehab, Casey was back in the octagon versus Jennifer Maia. Maia had previously fought for the flyweight title, giving Casey the ultimate opportunity to stamp her name among the flyweight elite. Right off the bat, we see that Jennifer has built upon what Antonina brought to the table. While southpaw Antonina wasn't able to get the hook going, orthodox Maia was. Maia essentially spams hooks on every one of Casey's entries. As time goes on, we can tell Casey is hitting harder than Maia, but Maia is just landing 2 strikes for every one that Casey comes with. The bulldozer Casey has been over the last 4 fights has now been slowed by an onslaught of bee stings, one could say. Maia doesn't hit hard enough to finish Casey, but she does land enough to win the fight by decision. In addition to Maia's strategy, it was clear that Casey was tentative, 6 months after her knee repair that usually averages 9 months to recover fully. Casey mentions this to Anik in the lead up to her next fight as well.
Suffering from, she had surgery for a torn ACL and came back a little bit too quickly in her words.
But let's roll this fight back a little bit. New to Casey's corner is the presence of this channel's pick for best coach of 2023, Eric Nixick. Now building to the final evolution of what I have come to mentally refer to as the Antonina flaw, Lipski comes with a power that Maia didn't. Returning to a bad analogy, Maia beat the Casey bulldozer by bee stings. Lipski is like World War II artillery. Just like Maia, Lipski comes with the 4-3-4 combo, pairing rear hook, lead hook, then rear hook while moving forward. And here's where we understand what the actual flaw in Antonina's flaw refers to. Like my prior critiques of Tony Ferguson, Casey has issues with her pocket presence after entries. What I mean by this is sort of difficult to verbalize, so I will attempt to show visually while giving my best explainer verbally. Pressure strikers like Casey and Tony play a dangerous game. Constantly pressing the striking action is a consistent winner as a strategy, irrespective of actual technical disparity between opponents. Casey's coach, Eric Nixick, knows this in both practice and in theory. I did a video on his theory of cage control and striking, which I highly recommend, but he also has practical knowledge because it is exactly how he and Sean Strickland game planned their way past the most dominant middleweight champion since Anderson Silva. But in every pressure striker, there's usually a singular flaw that gives opponents an out. Conor McGregor is one of the greatest pressure strikers in MMA history, while it is not even his greatest skill. Conor's greatness comes from his ability to generate the most insane angles off of opponents' entries that you have ever seen. His dominance comes from this trade-off. He can beat you downhill, or the more difficult uphill. Fighters don't want him to go downhill on them, so they choose uphill, which is easier for them too, right? It's easier to pressure than to defend yourself going backwards. But Conor is one of the greatest uphill counter geniuses in history. Casey's issues fascinatingly mirror Tony's. Both apply a sort of wrecking ball approach to pressure striking, where Conor played with opponents' momentum before angling and striking, Casey and Tony both just tough their way into the pocket, come what may, and basically signal to the opponent, meet me here or get out, I'm not moving. Correspondingly, Casey and Tony have the same flaw. If you create an angle when they refuse to move, you have open striking lanes for hooks. Antonina couldn't land it, Maya couldn't land it hard, but Lipski had none of those issues. Lipski batters Casey over 2 rounds before submitting her by vicious armbar. Now, I've been wanting to do a video on Casey for a while now. I have been studying her for years, but particularly focused in after her first pro loss to Maya. The fight essentially went how Casey wanted it to, but she was just outmatched strategically right. How do I form a recommendation for that? Throw more? She already throws a ton. Don't get hit? Thank you for the inspired critique, MMAI. So I was essentially stuck, and this video went onto the back burner. I have been dreading this fight ever since it was announced. I knew I needed to find a way to mentally rationalize that this was a bump in his career arc, and Tony could adapt to his age and continue fighting in a limited capacity, so I sat down and got to researching. I had previously done a Tony long-form essay, but I had written that from the perspective of, he's retiring this or probably next fight, and here we are with no end in sight. So this has to be tossed out, right? What I came up with was a modified Muay Thai practitioner subset known as a Muay Book. Quoting one's gym subsidiary, Evolve MMA, a Muay Book fighter is a relentless forward-moving machine that constantly puts pressure on their opponents, and having no favorite strike makes them unpredictable and dangerous. The thing I think most viewers watching this will immediately say to themselves is, but isn't that what he already does? No, not really. As I highlighted in my essay on Tony, a lot of his fighting persona that has become his entire brand as an athlete comes from the sort of logic of Muay Book style, but he's not all that talented of a Muay Thai practitioner. Tony's striking is much more boxing mixed with Kung Fu principles rather than Muay Thai fundamentals. I can't go too deep on this digression because it will detract from my overall point, but if unconvinced, check out my Tony essay and see if that does. If Tony transitioned more to this style of fighting, but from a more MMA context, I think you could see the revitalization basically every MMA fan secretly hopes for. I envision single collar ties galore, very prime DC with clinch strikes and sneaky wrestling maneuvers that keep the opponent constantly guessing at what's next. Rebuild that violent image by being unpredictable in the clinch, not from distance like he's trying to be now. But of course, MMA's diversity of arts makes it so that basically any strategy has a counter no matter how dominant it is. Connor's prodigious uphill skill set and his expert downhill played off each other perfectly, with one obvious counter: shoot a takedown underneath it. Even then, Connor again shows just how talented he was by displaying some of the best takedown defense I have seen from a highly striking-oriented fighter such as himself. Habib was eventually able to overcome that takedown defense and expose Connor's inability to get past Habib's prodigious top control scheme. The counter to the Muay Book for Tony comes in that same flavor. The main way to counter my Muay Book recommendation for Tony is to shoot takedowns underneath his pressure. Fantastic, you say, right? Tony is a decorated collegiate wrestler with some of the nastiest sprawl front headlock chokes in MMA history. Unfortunately, Tony's grappling defense became stale before gradually, then all at once imploding into a massive Achilles heel. I could choose any of these fights to demonstrate the point, but Patty really stands out to me. Remember back to earlier when we looked at Casey and her aggression with Dobson and Procopio from her back? Tony unfortunately has none of that. Tony instead channels his energy into outdated tactics from a bygone era of MMA when fighting out of guard was a way of consistently winning UFC fights. To put it simply, he gets stuck. More importantly, and worst of all, he thinks that's optimal. Tony demonstrates a number of tactics and positions key to the 10th Planet system, like rubber guard. And while not a 10th Planet tactic, it does fit the overall idea of my point. He uses some sort of a tie clinch from bottom while shoving his knee into Patty's throat, which is of course uncomfortable, but doesn't really win you a fight, as it isn't a submission-worthy discomfort. In the end, what I just talked about makes it so that Tony can't use my recommendation anymore. It would just become a new avenue, beating him to decision victories over and over again. It won't fix his issues, it will just add to them. But what about Casey? I've been making the foreshadowing pretty clear, I hope, but Casey's active guard removes the problem that Tony has, so now I have this video. Casey needs to realign her striking in a more clinch direction, while mixing in more knees and elbows as she has already demonstrated in a somewhat limited capacity. But I think there is more than just strategy at play with Casey. While I earlier tossed away easy critiques of her because they were both too simple and lack constructive feedback, one does still spring to mind that I think is accurate. I think that Casey is overthinking her actions, and that is exacerbating the Antonina flaw she has. But I of course hate saying things like that because it's weak analytically. So let's talk about it. One of my favorite college classes was a social psychology elective on group dynamics. Essentially, humans have a really tough time measuring themselves against peers, and we were studying how that changes as the size of the group used for comparison increases or decreases. This, of course, has a huge bearing in sports, where you can think of it sort of like, as your fan base increases, how does that affect how you train? More fans, more pressure, it has to have an effect. In 2021, Casey was ranked as ESPN's number 3 MMA prospect under 25, and the number 1 women's prospect in that same criteria. The only 2 fighters ahead of her were Song Yadong and Ilia Topuria, so consider just how high analysts like myself have been on her since her debut. I feel as though Casey is trying to live up to fictional expectations put on her by those outside of her day-to-day life, rather than trusting herself and those who know her. I don't know this for a fact, of course, but I just get a feeling, and that feeling is empathy. I feel like I'm in that right now in some ways. Take my personal experience. When you make video after video that generally tops out at like 10-ish thousand views, right? Then you suddenly make a video that does 30 times that amount, and you get mentioned on your favorite MMA show. You start to think this is the new benchmark. Again but bigger becomes your mantra. But the sort of spark isn't there. You go through the motions, but you're trying to recreate something you didn't set out to initially make, right? The ecosystem is irreparably shifted. The ceiling is higher, so the basement has to follow, right? Suddenly you're overthinking. Why did I decide to write it like that there? Or more fighting oriented? Why did this work then but not now? I don't have an answer to that riddle, Casey. But hey, if you're watching, I'll tell you what I'm trying. I'm just taking it a day at a time.